A sudden quiet descended on the grand hall. The music was still playing. No one had fainted. Instead, something unimaginable was happening. In the heart of Thornton Manor, under the sparkle of crystal chandeliers, Camille Ashford stood poised for cruelty. She was the stunning fiancée of Chicago's most feared crime lord. She raised a single cold finger, aiming it at a server who shook with fear. She was about to dismiss him publicly, just as she had done so many times before. The entire room froze. Waiters, bartenders, and guards stood like statues. Even the coordinator held her breath. Everyone understood what this meant. An outburst from Camille meant a life destroyed, and she was furious tonight, absolutely livid. But then, the impossible occurred. A voice broke the stillness. It was not shouting, not harsh, but firm, like a stream that never alters its path. The voice belonged to Evelyn, the new assistant for the event. She was a quiet girl who had worked there for just 3 days. She was the last person anyone expected to look up, much less challenge the boss's future wife before 300 influential people. Yet there she was, spine rigid, unwilling to be silent. All eyes turned to her. "What did you just say?" Camille seethed, her body shaking with a mix of shock and rage. But Evelyn held her ground. Her stance did not waver. Her gaze was polite, yet completely firm. At that same moment, unseen by the crowd, Gabriel Thornton returned from a call on the balcony. He was the master of this entire world. He paused, sensing the sudden strain in the room. He turned his head very slowly, and his eyes took in the scene. He saw his fiancée attempting to crush a simple employee, and he saw a young woman blocking her path. Gabriel remained still. He said nothing. He just observed. His own pulse quickened as a seed of doubt began to grow inside him. Camille's next shriek ripped through the air, startling everyone. "You are fired. Get your things and leave immediately." Yet Evelyn's response was steady. "Ma'am, if you would just let me explain the situation." That single instant was the pivot on which their futures would turn. Then a collective gasp went through the room as another, greater shock unfolded. A figure was approaching Gabriel from behind. It was someone who should not have been there. It was someone whose arrival would transform the evening into a reckoning that no one could have predicted. This is a story about the masks people wear and the courage it takes to rip them off. It will remind you that kindness is not weakness, that silence is not consent, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the greatest power. If you have ever been overlooked or mistreated by someone in a position of authority, this story will speak to your soul. Stay until the very end, because the truth behind everything will shock you. If you want to know who it is and what happens next, please show your support by liking this video, share it with friends who appreciate powerful emotional tales, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss our greatest stories. The figure was Nana Teresa, Gabriel Thornton's grandmother. She was 78 years old. Her silver white hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were sharp as knives, and she held a beautifully carved oak cane. Her pace was deliberate, and every tap of her cane on the floor sounded like a drumbeat in the quiet hall. Nobody in the room dared to even exhale. They all understood who Nana Teresa was. She had been Gabriel's guardian after his mother passed away. She was the one individual on earth that Gabriel Thornton, Chicago's undisputed crime king, treated with complete and total respect. When she spoke, he listened. When she gave an order, he obeyed. His obedience was not born from fear. It came from the profound love and reverence a grandson holds for his grandmother. Now, this formidable woman was right behind Gabriel. Her gaze was locked on Camille, seeming to pierce directly into the younger woman's spirit. Gabriel turned around, his expression showing a brief moment of surprise. "You are here." Nana Teresa did not meet her grandson's eyes. She just inclined her head slightly before moving on toward the hall's center. The guests parted for her without a word, like the sea before a great ship. Nobody blocked her path. Nobody made a sound. The only noise was the rhythmic tap of her cane on the marble, marking time in the silent room. Camille was frozen in place, like a statue. Her arm was still extended, her finger aimed at Henry, but her entire body looked as if it were carved from ice. She recognized Nana Teresa. They had met on 2 previous occasions. Both encounters were short, formal, and meticulously planned to let Camille showcase her curated image of kindness. This was not like those times. The older woman had arrived unannounced. She had witnessed the entire scene. Nana Teresa paused 3 paces away from Camille. She remained silent. She just stood and appraised the young woman with a gaze as frigid as a winter storm. She then shifted her attention to Henry, who was still shaking with terror. Her eyes moved to Evelyn, the girl who stood tall with a strange sense of peace. At last she faced Camille again and began to speak. Her voice was quiet, but in the complete stillness of the hall, each word was as clear as a chime. "So, this is the woman who will marry my grandson." The words were not a query, they were a verdict. Camille tried to swallow, her throat feeling like sandpaper. She attempted a smile, but her mouth twisted into a nervous, unstable shape. "Nana," she said, her voice strained and thin, "I had no idea you would be here. This is such a lovely surprise." Nana Teresa offered no smile in return. She did not nod. She merely canted her head slightly, like a scientist observing a curious specimen. "A surprise," she repeated with deliberation. "I am not the one who is surprised. I believe the guests are surprised. They are surprised to see the way you behave toward the staff." The color vanished from Camille's face. The change was so sudden and complete that everyone could see it. She started to speak, but Nana Teresa lifted a hand. The motion was small, but it stopped Camille completely. "I witnessed it all, my dear," Nana Teresa continued, her voice as level as if she were discussing the forecast. "I saw you aim your finger at a man because of a minor error. I saw your willingness to ruin a person's livelihood without a second thought. And I saw you behaving before 300 people, as though you were the mistress of this home." She paused briefly. "But you are not the mistress here, Camille. You are merely a guest, and a guest has no authority to dismiss the staff." Camille began to shake. It was the first time she had ever been left speechless. Her eyes darted to Gabriel, pleading for him to intervene and protect her. But Gabriel did not move. The affection had vanished from his gaze. In its place were uncertainty and disillusionment. He looked like a man forced to accept a terrible truth. The atmosphere in the hall was stretched tight, ready to break. During that thick, quiet moment, Henry suddenly fell to his knees. The impact of his knees on the stone floor made a sharp, brittle sound. He paid no mind to the sting of it. He was unaware of the 300 sets of eyes watching him. His only thought was that his world was ending. "Please," Henry pleaded, his voice cracking and fragile. "Please give me another chance. My daughter is in the hospital. She is only 12 years old. She has leukemia." He paused, struggling to hold back a sob that was building in his chest. "Her doctor told me that if she does not have the operation this month, she will die. This job is all I have. I need every single dollar. Please, I am asking you." Tears flowed freely down the 45-year-old man's tired face. They were the tears of a father pushed to his limit. They were the tears of someone giving up all his pride just for the chance to save his child. The whole room became silent once more. 300 of Chicago's most influential figures were as still as stone. This group included crime lords, executives, and officials, men who were familiar with violence and sorrow. Yet even they could not turn away from the scene. It was a father on his knees, begging for the life of his daughter. Evelyn was nearby, her own eyes filled with a fierce emotion. She watched Henry and recognized his struggle as her own. She knew the hopelessness of seeing a loved one in pain without the funds to help. She knew the agony of being ready to sacrifice anything for family, because that was the reality of her own life. But Camille did not know this feeling. or she chose to ignore it. She gazed down at Henry, her eyes like frozen pools. There was no sign of emotion, no hint of pity, not one moment of doubt. Her features remained flawless and lovely, like a piece of art. But it was a cold beauty, the beauty of a soul that had hardened into stone years ago. "So your daughter is ill," Camille remarked. Her tone was casual, as if they were discussing the weather. "In that case, you ought to have paid better attention to your job. You poured wine on my gown. This gown is worth $50,000. Do you have any idea of the damage you caused?" She let out a brief, contemptuous laugh that made everyone's blood run cold. "Or perhaps I should deduct it from your salary." "Oh, that's right. You no longer have a salary, do you?" Her words were sharp blades plunging directly into Henry's soul. He lowered his head as his body was racked with spasms. His choked sobs echoed through the hall, raw with pain and hopelessness. Gabriel stood not far away, observing it all. And in that moment, for the first time in 3 years with Camille, he saw her real face. It was not the gentle, sophisticated woman he thought he knew. It was not the girl who understood the perfect time to smile, the right thing to say, the person who made him believe she was the most flawless woman alive. Instead, he saw a cold, merciless woman capable of crushing other people without a single flicker of emotion. He recalled employees who had vanished from their jobs without a word of explanation. He recalled the terror in people's eyes whenever Camille stepped into a room. He recalled the hushed whispers that evaporated the second he came near. All of those disconnected fragments began to snap into place in his mind, and the image that formed was horrifying. Nana Teresa stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the scene. She said nothing, but her stare at Camille communicated everything. It was a look of pure disappointment, the kind of look from someone who had seen directly into another person's soul. Gabriel moved to Henry's side, helping him get back on his feet. His voice was quiet, but unshakable. "You will not be fired." Henry raised his head, his red-rimmed eyes staring at Gabriel in disbelief. Camille flinched, turning to face Gabriel with shock plastered on her features. But Gabriel did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Henry and went on. "Your daughter will get medical care. I will see to it." Then, he finally turned to Camille. His eyes were colder than she had ever witnessed. "We are going to talk later." Camille parted her lips to speak, but at that precise moment, the phone in her pocket buzzed to life, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen, and that is when her world began to fracture. But this was just the start, because the secret Camille harbored was 1,000 times more sinister. 4 weeks before, Gabriel Thornton's life had still been flawless, or at least that was his belief. Gabriel Thornton, 36 years old, was the most formidable mafia leader in Chicago, the type of man whose name alone commanded respect from the entire underworld. But Gabriel was different from the other bosses. He did not construct his empire on the suffering of innocent people. He constructed it on principles of fairness and loyalty, following one sacred rule he learned from Nana Teresa: never bring harm to those who are blameless. Within Chicago's criminal circles, Gabriel was regarded as a man of integrity. He shielded poor communities from drug peddlers. He assisted families in desperate need when they had no other options. He brought retribution to those who targeted the vulnerable, and he absolutely forbade anyone in his organization from touching women or children. That was the reason people admired him, not from fear, but because he had earned their genuine respect. And standing next to that powerful man was Camille Ashford, the woman he intended to spend the rest of his life with. Gabriel had met Camille 3 years prior at a charity event. She was stunning. She was brilliant. She knew how to speak, how to smile, how to make him feel like the most fortunate man on earth. Camille shared her history with him. She was an orphan, self-reliant from an early age, who had pulled herself up from nothing to become a prosperous entrepreneur. Gabriel found that admirable. He respected her tenacity. He was convinced she was the ideal woman for him. But he was mistaken. He was profoundly mistaken, because Camille had two different personas. When Gabriel was present, she was the very picture of kindness. She smiled at the staff. She inquired about their well-being. She even knew the names of every employee's children. But when Gabriel was not around, Camille transformed into someone entirely different. She would scream at workers for the most trivial errors. She would degrade them in front of their colleagues. She would threaten their employment over a look she found displeasing, and she did it all with an icy smile on her face, as if inflicting pain on others brought her a twisted, secret satisfaction. The employees at the Thornton estate lived in a state of constant dread. They were afraid to tell Gabriel, knowing Camille would discover a way to make them pay. They were afraid to resign, needing the income to support their families. Their only option was to endure the abuse in silence and hope each day would conclude without incident. But now, standing in the great hall of Thornton Manor, seeing how Camille was treating Henry, Gabriel started to remember everything. He thought of the maid who left without a word 2 months ago. He thought of the old chef, a man who served his family for 15 years, suddenly requesting a transfer. He thought of the terror in the eyes of his staff whenever Camille walked into a room. He once believed it was respect, but that was wrong. It was fear, absolute fear. A crushing weight settled on Gabriel's chest. He had been a fool. For 3 years, he lived with a woman he never knew. He had fallen in love with a fabrication. He was about to marry a ghost. His eyes scanned the room, landing on his most trusted bodyguard, Marco. The man had been his shadow for 10 years, a model of loyalty. Gabriel gave a tiny nod, summoning Marco to his side. His voice was quiet but sharp as ice. Investigate her. Find everything. Her past, her present, every secret she is hiding. I want it all. Marco simply nodded. He understood. He never needed an explanation. Gabriel looked back at Camille, who was trying to compose herself after Nana Teresa's outburst. She was still stunning, still magnetic, still perfect in every single way. But Gabriel no longer saw that beauty. He saw only a fraud. He saw only lies dressed in expensive clothes. He saw a stranger wearing the face of his fiancée. And in that quiet moment, Gabriel began to wonder what else he did not know about Camille. How many secrets did she have? How many lies had he accepted as truth? He did not realize that the answers would arrive far sooner than he expected, and they would be more terrible than he could ever imagine, because Gabriel was completely in the dark. That the woman he had placed his greatest trust in was hiding a past that had the power to ruin everything. 3 weeks prior, on a frigid winter morning, Evelyn Sinclair walked through the gates of the Thornton estate, her heart pounding inside her chest. She was 27 years old. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a neat tie, and her green eyes shone with hope. This was her third job in just 1 month. She was working as an event assistant at the home of Chicago's most powerful mafia figure. The wage was not exceptional, but it was another small step toward achieving her objective. And for Evelyn, every single dollar was precious. Life had never been simple for her. Evelyn became an orphan at the age of 5. A car crash on a stormy night had claimed both of her parents. She and her younger sister Chloe, who was just 2 at the time, were placed in St. Mary's Orphanage on the edge of Chicago. People claimed an orphanage was a sanctuary for children with nowhere else to turn. But St. Mary's was nothing of the sort. St. Mary's was a place of suffering. Evelyn could still recall the nights her stomach ached with hunger after being punished with no food. She could still recall the welts on her back for the simple offense of crying because she missed her mother. She could still recall the head matron, whose eyes were like ice and whose smile was pure cruelty. That woman transformed Evelyn's childhood into an unending series of nightmares. But the physical pain was not the worst part. The most agonizing moment came when Evelyn was 10, and Chloe was adopted by a different family. They tore the sisters from each other. They refused to let Evelyn say a final goodbye. They just showed up, signed the documents, and led Chloe away, as if she were a piece of property. Evelyn wept for months on end. She made a vow that someday she would find her sister again, regardless of the cost. At 16, Evelyn escaped from the orphanage. She survived on the streets of Chicago, accepting any work she could find. Washing dishes, cleaning buildings, passing out flyers on the street. She did anything that would provide a few dollars for food and a small room in a rundown apartment. She had no diploma, no relatives, nothing except her own two hands and an unbreakable will. Yet she endured. She struggled. She never lost hope. Then, 2 years ago, something incredible happened. Evelyn located Chloe. Her sister, now 22, was living in a small apartment after her adoptive parents had declared bankruptcy and abandoned her. But their joyful reunion was quickly darkened by devastating news. Chloe suffered from a congenital heart defect. She required an operation. The price was $200,000, an impossible amount for two orphaned sisters with nothing. From that moment on, Evelyn worked non-stop. She juggled 3 jobs simultaneously, working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. She had no holidays, no personal time, just a single focus: earn enough money to save her sister. And the position at the Thornton estate was a piece of that puzzle. On her first day, an older staff member pulled Evelyn aside into a corner. She was a middle-aged woman with weary eyes and a nervous, hushed voice. "Listen to me, kid," the woman said, her eyes flicking around as if worried they were being overheard. "I am going to give you one bit of advice. Keep your distance from Miss Camille." Evelyn furrowed her brow. "Who is Miss Camille?" The woman let out a sigh. "The boss's fiancée. She appears lovely and kind, but do not be deceived by it. When the boss is gone, she is a true monster." The woman gripped Evelyn's hand. "Do not argue with her. Do not look directly into her eyes. Do not do anything to make her notice you. If she does, you will be sorry." Evelyn understood, but she felt no fear. She had survived the hell of living on the streets. She had endured days of starvation. She had confronted the worst that life could offer. A wealthy woman who enjoyed tormenting people was nothing compared to what she had already overcome. That evening, Evelyn went home to her shabby little apartment in a South Chicago slum. The place was a single room with water-stained walls and a window that would not shut completely. But it was her home, a space where she and Chloe could be together. Chloe was lying on the small bed in the corner. Her sister was 24 years old, thin and pale, her lips colorless from anemia. Her heart condition was worsening. The doctor had warned that she needed an operation in the next 6 months. Otherwise, her heart would fail. "You are home," Chloe said with a faint voice, attempting a smile. "How is the new job?" Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, holding Chloe's cold hand. "It is fine. The money is better than I thought it would be." She was not telling the truth. She never did, because she did not want her sister to worry. Chloe looked at her, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "You work too hard. You are getting thinner." Evelyn just shook her head and smiled. "I am okay. I am strong." Once Chloe was asleep, Evelyn pulled out her savings book and stared at the balance. $15,000. It was all she had saved after 2 years of working to exhaustion. $15,000 of the $200,000 she needed. She was short by $185,000. The number was crushing. It felt like an unclimbable mountain. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. She put the book away and turned to watch her sleeping sister. Chloe appeared so calm, so pure, so worthy of living. Evelyn knelt by the bed, held Chloe's hand, and whispered, her voice cracking but firm with determination. "I will save you, no matter what it takes. I promise I will save you." She had no idea how she would accomplish it. She did not know where to find a miracle. All she knew was that she would not surrender. Not now, not ever. Evelyn could not have known that in a few short weeks she would face a decision that could alter both of their destinies. Back at the birthday celebration inside the Thornton mansion, the tension was so thick you could hardly breathe after what had occurred. Henry had been led outside to compose himself. Nana Teresa stood in place like a stone monument, her gaze fixed on Camille. Gabriel was only a few feet from his fiancée, but that small space now seemed like a giant canyon that no one could cross. Evelyn slipped back quietly, trying to disappear among the staff lined against the wall. She did not want any more attention. She just wanted the night to be over so she could return to Chloe. Camille tried to regain her composure. She adjusted her hair and managed a fragile smile for the guests. "It was just a little misunderstanding," she announced, her voice pitched higher than normal, betraying the panic she tried to conceal. "Let us get back to the party." But nobody moved. 300 guests were frozen in place like statues, their eyes still locked on Camille with a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and even disdain. They had witnessed her true nature. They had seen her cruelty toward a poor man. No smile could hide that. At that moment, the phone in Camille's pocket started to ring. The noise sliced through the room's silence, piercing and unnatural, like a fire alarm in the dead of night. Camille jumped. She took out her phone and saw an unknown number on the screen. She intended to ignore it, but a strange feeling made her pause. Perhaps it was a premonition. Perhaps it was the faint sense of dread rising from deep within her. She answered the call. "Hello," she said, her voice still coated in a fake calmness. A man's voice came over the line, icy and deliberate, like a judge delivering a final verdict. "Your day of reckoning has come, Victoria." Camille froze, and the color drained from her face. Her eyes grew wide with terror. Her hand was trembling so violently she almost dropped the phone. Victoria. Someone had called her by that name, the name she had left behind 5 years ago. The name she thought nobody would ever say again. Her real name. "Who is this?" Camille breathed into the phone, her voice shaking beyond her control. "What is it that you want?" But the only reply was a cold laugh. It was a laugh full of bitterness and pure hatred. Then the connection was cut. Camille remained standing with the phone in her hand, her face as white as a sheet. She could not move. She could not process what had happened. She only knew that the past she had run from had finally found her. Gabriel saw everything. He saw the transformation on Camille's face. He saw the raw fear in her eyes. He saw her hand shaking like a leaf in the wind. And he understood that this was no ordinary phone call. Victoria. He had heard the name the man had called Camille. But his Camille was Camille Ashford, not Victoria. So who was Victoria? Nana Teresa's expression hardened as well. She had lived long enough to know when a person was hiding something, and the woman in front of her was clearly concealing a massive secret. The room started to fill with murmurs. Whispers spread like a virus through the crowd. What was that? Who was on the phone? Why does she look so scared? Camille felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on her. She could feel the doubt growing in the air. She knew she had to act, say something, seize control before she lost it completely. But before she could speak, the phone in her hand vibrated again. A text message. Camille glanced down at the screen. It was from the same unknown number. She did not want to look at it. She was afraid to look at it, but her eyes were drawn to the glowing words on the display. "Do you think moving to Chicago means you got away? I am here. Boston has not forgotten about you." The phone fell from Camille's grasp. It clattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and loud in the silent hall. Camille stood there, trembling uncontrollably from head to toe. Her face was deathly pale, her lips parted, but no words came out. Boston. The name hit her like a dagger in the heart. Boston was the city she had spent 5 years trying to erase from her memory. Boston was the place that held her darkest secret. Everyone in the room saw the phone fall. Everyone saw the look of sheer panic on Camille's face. The whispering grew louder, and eyes filled with curiosity, suspicion, and a hungry desire to see what would happen next. Gabriel moved forward, bent down, and retrieved the phone. Camille wanted to tell him to stop. She wanted to grab it from him, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. She was paralyzed. She could only stand and watch as Gabriel read the text on the screen. The world seemed to grind to a halt. Gabriel read every word with a slow deliberation. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes grew dark, like a sky before a storm. When he looked up at Camille, his stare was colder than any she had ever faced. "Camille," Gabriel said, his voice calm and heavy, like a hammer striking stone. "What happened in Boston?" Camille tried to speak. She wanted to give an answer. She wanted to explain it away. She wanted to craft a perfect lie, just as she had for years. But the words would not come. Fear had tightened its grip on her throat. Fear had erased every excuse she had ever prepared. Gabriel took one step closer, his gaze piercing through her. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, each word precise and sharp. "What happened in Boston? And who is Victoria?" Camille flinched when she heard the name. Victoria. Gabriel had heard it. He had heard the man use her real name. There was nowhere left to hide. There were no more lies to tell. Camille stuttered, her voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. "He is just some crazy person. I have no idea who he is. I swear I do not know him." Gabriel studied her. He watched her terrified eyes darting around. He saw the desperate tension in her face. He saw her for exactly who she was. And he was certain. He was certain she was lying, just as she had been lying to him for who knows how long. Nana Teresa moved to stand beside Gabriel. She said nothing. She simply stood there. Her eyes were fixed on Camille, filled with an unmistakable disappointment and scorn. Her presence was a clear signal that Camille was not just facing Gabriel. She was facing the entire Thornon family. Evelyn observed the scene unfold from her corner. She did not know the details of what was happening. She did not know the significance of Boston. She did not know who Victoria was. But she knew in her gut that the night was about to shatter. Tonight would be the night that everything came crashing down. 300 guests stood like statues, their attention fixed on the drama before them. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to move. They could only stand and wait. They waited for the truth to be exposed. They waited for Camille Ashford's facade to crumble. And Camille understood that her time was running out. She had to do something, anything at all, to save herself. Camille knew she was trapped. She knew Gabriel no longer believed her. She knew Nana Teresa was staring at her with open contempt. She knew 300 guests were waiting for her to break. But Camille was not a woman who shattered. She had survived the last 5 years on lies, on deception, on pointing the finger at someone else. She would not stop now. Not while she still had a breath to fight. The only weapon left to her was to attack. Camille's gaze raked across the room, hunting for a target, for a sacrifice to absorb the coming blow. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn, the young woman standing in the corner, quiet and unassuming as ever. Her, Camille decided. This all started with her. She was the one who challenged me in front of everybody. She is the weakest person here. Camille knew she would crush her. "It was her!" Camille yelled, her fingers shooting out toward Evelyn like a blade. She is the one behind everything. The entire room flinched, every single head turning toward Evelyn, who was frozen in place by the shock. Camille marched toward her, her face a mask of fury and desperation. "She is a spy!" Camille shrieked, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "Someone sent her here to destroy me. She is the one who took the call from that man. She is the one who orchestrated this entire thing to ruin my life." A low murmur spread through the room. The guests exchanged glances, their eyes shifting from Evelyn to Camille and back again. They could not tell who to believe. They had no idea what the truth was. They only knew the night's spectacle was escalating with every passing second. Evelyn stood motionless, feeling hundreds of stares stab into her like tiny daggers. She could feel the suspicion poisoning the air around her. She could feel herself being made the scapegoat for a crime she did not commit. But Evelyn felt no fear. She had endured too much injustice, To be scared now. She had been blamed for things too many times in the orphanage to be broken by false charges. She only had to say what was true. The truth was her shield. Evelyn raised her head, meeting Camille's hateful glare. Her green eyes were perfectly calm, as still as a deep lake. "Ma'am," Evelyn said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I have only worked in this house for 3 days." She let the words hang in the air, letting everyone absorb them. 3 days? I know nothing about a place called Boston. I know nothing about a phone call. I did not even know your name before I came to this estate. Camille's jaw tightened. "She is lying," Camille screamed. "She is lying to every single one of you. Do not listen to her." But Evelyn did not waver. She just stood there, her back straight, her chin high, her eyes fixed forward. She felt no need to defend herself any further. She did not need to plead for anyone's trust. The truth was there, simple and clear. 3 days. No one could organize such a detailed conspiracy in only 3 days. Gabriel stood between them, observing everything. He looked at Camille, who was panicked and shouting, deflecting blame in all directions like a trapped animal. Then his gaze fell on Evelyn, who stood with a serene composure that was almost impossible to believe. One was pure chaos. The other was absolute stillness. One was throwing baseless accusations. The other was offering a simple, undeniable fact. Gabriel did not need long to see who was telling the truth. His world had taught him how to read a person's character in a single glance. And right now, Camille's eyes held the raw terror of someone whose lies were about to be exposed. Evelyn's eyes, however, were clear, like a person with absolutely nothing to hide. "Enough," Gabriel said. His voice was not loud, but it carried enough power to silence the entire room. Camille stopped her screaming. Evelyn remained perfectly still. 300 guests held their breath. Gabriel turned his attention to Camille. His eyes were as cold as steel. "You will not blame anyone else," he said slowly, each word landing like a heavy weight. "Now you will answer my question. Boston Victoria, what is the truth?" Gabriel raised one hand, giving a small signal. It was a subtle gesture, but everyone in the grand hall knew what it meant. Instantly, the sound of heavy footsteps came from all sides. Security men dressed in black suits moved with swift, programmed precision. They slammed every single door shut. The cold sound of metal locks clicking into place echoed through the hall. "No one is leaving," Gabriel announced, his voice low and freezing. "Not until I give the word." 300 guests stood like statues. They were the most powerful figures in Chicago. They were bosses, executives, and politicians, all people accustomed to giving commands and being obeyed. But inside this room, before Gabriel Thornton, they were merely guests. And when the head of the Thornton Empire gave an order, nobody dared to challenge him. Camille frantically looked around. She saw the doors were sealed. She saw guards standing at every possible exit. She saw unfamiliar faces staring back at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and scorn. There was nowhere to go. There were no paths left to escape. Gabriel started walking toward her. Each of his steps echoed on the marble floor with a steady beat, like a clock ticking down to 0. He stopped less than a foot away from her, his gaze locked on hers, sharp enough to slice right through her defenses. Camille wanted to back away. She wanted to run from those eyes, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. She was completely unable to move. She could only stand there, shaking like a small creature cornered by a predator. "Tell me," Gabriel said, his voice slow and exact, with every word perfectly cut. "Who is Victoria?" Camille opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "What happened in Boston?" She struggled to speak, desperately trying to invent a lie, a story, anything to save herself. But her mind was a complete blank. Fear had paralyzed her thoughts. "Speak," Gabriel demanded, his voice dropping to a low rumble that sounded like a lion's growl. "Right now." Each word was a hammer blow, each one a judgment being delivered. Camille felt her legs begin to buckle. She felt her entire body collapsing from the inside out. She had worked for 5 years to build a new life. 5 years to bury who she was. 5 years to become Camille Ashford, the flawless partner of Chicago's most powerful crime lord. And now, all of it was about to be destroyed. In one night, because of a single phone call, because of a single text message. Nana Teresa stood nearby, watching everything in silence. She offered no words. She made no move to interfere. She simply stood like a judge, waiting for the defendant to confess. Her eyes were cold and sharp, taking in every detail on Camille's face. Evelyn stayed in her corner, quiet as a ghost. She did not understand the full story. She did not know what secret Camille was hiding, but she sensed that the truth was about to be revealed, and that this truth would be more terrible than anyone could possibly guess. Gabriel remained exactly where he was, waiting. He did not press her again. He did not have to. His silence was more intimidating than any spoken threat. It wrapped around Camille like an invisible cage, squeezing tighter and tighter until she could barely draw a breath. Camille scanned the room one last time, looking for any help, for anyone who might side with her. But she found no one. The people she had considered friends now avoided her gaze. The people she had once charmed now looked at her like a stranger. She was utterly and completely alone. Tears started to stream down Camille's face. They were not tears of regret. They were tears of pure despair. The tears of a person who finally knows they have lost. "Please," Camille whispered, her voice shaking and cracking. "Not here. Not in front of all these people." Gabriel did not stir. "Here," he commanded, his tone allowing no room for argument. "In front of everyone. Right now." Camille knew then that she had no choice left. She had to reveal the truth, even if that truth would utterly ruin her. Camille's body gave out. Her knees hit the hard marble with a thud that should have been painful, but she was numb to everything now. She lacked the energy to stand. She lacked the energy to keep up the pretense. She lacked the energy to continue a fight she now knew had been lost a long time ago. "All right," Camille whispered, her voice thin and shattered like broken glass. "I will talk. I will tell you everything." Gabriel just stood over her, looking down at the woman kneeling before him. He remained silent. He just waited. The entire hall waited with him. 300 people held their breath, leaning in to hear every word that was about to come from the woman once thought to be perfect. Camille's voice shook as she started to speak. "My real name is not Camille Ashford." She forced herself to look up at Gabriel, her eyes filled with tears and desperation. "My real name is Victoria, Victoria Ashford." A ripple of gasps and whispers spread through the room. Victoria Ashford, not Camille. The name had been a fake, a cover story, a lie that had lasted for years. Gabriel did not react. His expression remained as hard as stone, but deep in his eyes, something had just been extinguished. Trust, love, everything he had ever offered this woman. Camille, who was actually Victoria, continued. Each word felt as if it were being torn from the deepest part of the hell she had tried to leave behind 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was living in Boston. I had a job at a major financial company. I was an assistant for the executive committee. She paused, swallowing hard as if the next words were physically painful to say. I stole money from the company. $2 million. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. $2 million. It was an enormous sum. It was a crime that seemed impossible to forgive. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was what Victoria did next to hide her crime. When the company found out the money was gone, Victoria's voice became a whisper filled with shame as she went on. I framed someone else, the chief financial officer. His name was Richard Donovan. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could not stand to see the memory she was about to share. He was a kind man. He trusted me completely. He looked after me like a younger sister, and I created false evidence to make him look guilty. I lied to the authorities. I committed perjury in court. I ruined his entire life. Tears streamed down Victoria's face. He was dismissed from his job. He was called a thief. His wife left him and took their child. He lost it all. His house, his career, his good name, everything. It was all my fault. She hung her head, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. I knew he was not guilty. I knew I was destroying an honorable man. But I did not care. I was scared. I was a coward. I was only thinking of myself. The room was utterly still. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted their weight. They were all frozen, shocked by the confession they had just heard. The lovely, elegant, flawless woman they had all looked up to was a fake, a criminal. She was someone who had destroyed an innocent person's life just to protect her own. When the initial shock passed, Victoria spoke again, her voice hollow, like a shell without a soul. I took the money I had embezzled and fled to Chicago. I spent 2 years covering my past and creating a new identity before I became Camille Ashford, an orphan who had made her own success from nothing. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was all a lie. Every part of it. I did not make anything. I built my new life on stolen funds, on the tears of another person, on the pain of a man who did nothing wrong. Gabriel stood like a statue carved from ice. He could not process what she was saying. The woman he adored, the woman he was going to make his wife, the woman he trusted above all others in the world. Their entire relationship had been a performance, an elaborate act that had gone on for 3 years. "You told me you built your business with your own 2 hands," Gabriel said, his voice deep and heavy, as if every word was a stone he had to lift. "You said you believed in justice. You said you despised people who preyed on the vulnerable." He looked down at Victoria, and his stare was so cold it made her tremble. "But you are the predator. You are the one who crushed an innocent man. You are the very thing you claimed to hate." Victoria had no reply. She could only stay on her knees and weep, feeling each word like a whip against her spirit. And at that precise instant, the large double doors to the hall were thrown open with a violent crash. A flood of light poured in from the hallway, outlining the shape of a man standing in the doorway. He had used the commotion at the service entrance during a shift change. Slipping through a door a careless employee had left open for a moment to get past the outer security. Every head turned to see him, and the sight held them captive. He was a man around 55 years old. His hair was white and messy, a tangled mess that looked like it had not been brushed in weeks. His face was thin and drawn, with sharp cheekbones and wrinkled gray skin, like a man who had endured too much for too long. He had on an old, shabby suit, the kind that might have once been worn by a professional. Now, however, it was worn out, with frayed edges on the cuffs and shoulders. His leather shoes were dried out and covered in a layer of grime from the streets. But the most terrifying part of him was not his ragged state. The most terrifying part was his eyes. They were red-rimmed and wild, filled with a hatred and agony that had been building for years. They were the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. They were the eyes of a man who had been cast into the deepest pit of despair. They were the eyes of a man who had dedicated his life to finding justice. 2 security guards immediately moved forward to intercept the intruder. But Gabriel raised his hand, motioning for them to stand down. He needed to know who this man was. He needed to know why he had shown up at this exact time, and somewhere inside, he felt he already knew the truth. The man entered the hall, his steps slow and heavy, as if he were carrying an immense burden. He scanned the room, his bloodshot gaze passing over the strange faces. He was looking for someone. He was looking for the one who had shattered his world. "Where is she?" the man asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Where is Victoria Ashford?" The name was like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. Victoria Ashford. The name Camille had just admitted was her real one. The name she had tried to leave behind 5 years ago. The name that had now come back to haunt her. Camille, or rather, Victoria, saw the man and let out a scream. It was a cry of raw terror that sliced through the silent room, bouncing off the walls. It was the sound of someone seeing a specter from their past. It was the sound of someone who knew their day of reckoning had finally come. "No!" Victoria shrieked, scrambling backward as if to get away from a living nightmare. "No, it cannot be you!" The man froze, his gaze fixed on Victoria. And in that instant, everyone in the room could feel the white-hot rage that burned in his eyes. It was the fury of 5 years of misery, 5 years of injustice, 5 years of being blamed while no one would listen to him. "Victoria Ashford," the man said, his voice now chillingly composed. "I have found you at last." Gabriel looked from the man to Victoria. He did not need to ask any questions to know who this was. He had heard the entire story from Victoria's own lips just moments before. The ruined man standing before them was Richard Donovan. He was the chief financial officer Victoria had set up 5 years ago. The man who had lost his career, lost his wife, lost his daughter, lost his entire life because of a single lie told by the woman now cowering on the floor. Richard started walking toward Victoria, each step slow and deliberate, filled with menace. Victoria kept backing away until she was pressed against the wall. There was nowhere else for her to go. 5 years, Richard said, his voice heavy with sorrow. For 5 years, I have looked for you. For 5 years, I have lived in torment because of what you did. For 5 years, I have been without everything because of you. He stopped just a short distance from Victoria, his eyes filled with tears. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, because after all this time, after all the agony, he had finally cornered the person who had demolished his life. "Do you have any idea what my life has been like?" Richard asked, his voice starting to fracture. "Do you?" Victoria gave no response. She could only weep and shake like a leaf caught in a gale. Richard stood before her, his eyes red from countless sleepless nights and years of pain. He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if trying to control the storm of feelings raging inside him. Then he began to speak, to tell them all about the nightmare he had endured for the last 5 years. "When you set me up," Richard began, his voice unsteady but each word perfectly clear, "I could not believe it was happening. I was sure the truth would be revealed. I was sure that justice would prevail. But it did not. Your forged documents were too convincing. Your lies were too believable. And I, a man of 50 with 30 years of honest work to my name, was branded a common thief." He stopped for a moment, swallowing against a lump in his throat. "I was terminated on the spot. No one was interested in my side of the story. No one was willing to believe I was innocent. I was turned into a pariah in a single day. 30 years of hard work, 30 years of building a good reputation. All of it vanished into thin air because of one thing you said." Victoria cried harder. But Richard would not be silenced. He had to tell his story. He had to make everyone understand his suffering. "My wife," Richard went on, his voice cracking as he spoke of his family. "She did not believe me. After 25 years of marriage, she looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. She told me she could not be married to a criminal. She took our daughter with her, and she left me." Tears started to roll down Richard's face. "My little girl, she was only 15. That was when my world ended. My daughter was my everything. She was why I woke up and faced each day. Then she looked at me with pure disappointment and told me she was ashamed I was her father." His voice cracked. My heart stopped beating that day. The entire ballroom was utterly still. 300 guests were frozen, and tears streamed down the faces of many as they absorbed Richard's words. These were powerful individuals, accustomed to the world's harsh realities, yet his story broke through their defenses. Richard continued. After my job and family were gone, my home followed. Nobody would hire a man branded an embezzler. Nobody would give me a second look. I spent 3 years homeless in Boston. For 3 years I slept under bridges. For 3 years I begged for every meal. For 3 years, people looked through me like I was filth. He glanced down at his own hands, palms now thin and calloused from a life of hardship. Some nights I would stand on a bridge, staring at the dark water below, and think about how easy it would be to just let go. Some nights I would hold a blade to my own wrist and wonder if a single motion could stop the pain. Victoria let out a choked cry. No, please, don't. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. But Richard did not stop. I survived, he stated, his voice now eerily calm, as if he had moved beyond pain into a place of complete emptiness. I survived because I needed the truth to come out. I needed to prove my innocence. I needed to find you and get my justice. He locked his gaze onto Victoria. 5 years. I lived through 5 years of hell because of your lies. I lost everything I ever cared about for 5 years because of you. I searched for you for 5 long years. And tonight, I have finally found you. Victoria crumpled to the floor at Richard's feet as tears streamed down her cheeks. I am so sorry, she wept, the words coming out in broken, ragged pieces. I know what I did was wrong. I know it was unforgivable. But I will fix this. I will do anything you ask to make it right. Money, your reputation, whatever you want, I will do it, please. Richard looked down at the woman kneeling before him and let out a laugh. It was a bitter, painful sound, almost a sob itself. Make it right, he repeated slowly. You say you will make it right. He bent lower, his eyes boring into hers. Then tell me, can you give me back the 5 years I lost? Can you undo the nights I spent freezing on the street? Can you bring my family back to me? Can you give me back my daughter? Can you restore the honor you stole from me? Can you return everything you have taken? Victoria had no answer. She could only weep and shake her head. No, she could not. No one ever could. What had been destroyed was gone forever. From a corner of the room, Evelyn watched the scene unfold. Tears were also tracing paths down her face. She recognized Richard's agony. She knew the feeling of being wrongly accused with no one to believe you. She understood the hopelessness of being abandoned by the entire world, having survived similar days at the orphanage. She silently took a handkerchief from her pocket, walked over to Richard, and held it out to him. She said nothing. The simple gesture was filled with a deep, silent understanding. Richard looked up at Evelyn, surprised. He accepted the handkerchief and dried his face. Thank you, he murmured. Evelyn just gave a slight nod and stepped away. She did not need his thanks. She just needed him to know he was not alone, that his pain was seen, and that justice, however late, was finally here. Gabriel remained perfectly still as Richard shared his account. He took in every single word, every painful detail, every ounce of suffering the man had endured for 5 years. With every sentence Richard uttered, Gabriel's disappointment deepened. The cold anger inside him grew hotter. It was not anger at Richard. It was fury directed at the woman he had once cherished, the woman he had once put his faith in, the woman who had lived a lie for 3 entire years. Gabriel began to walk toward Richard. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate on the marble. He stopped just a pace away, looking directly into the haunted, bloodshot eyes of a man who had suffered a profound injustice. How much did she take from you? Gabriel asked, his voice quiet and sharp. Richard looked at him, startled, the abrupt question taking a moment to register. Gabriel was asking about the embezzled funds, the money that had been used to frame him. $2 million, Richard replied, his voice raspy and tired. Then he shook his head. But I do not want the money. He met Gabriel's gaze, his own eyes full of pain. Money will not give me back what I lost. It cannot erase 5 years of misery. It will not return my family, my daughter, or the life I once had. He took a slow breath. What I want is my honor. I want people to know I am innocent. I want my name cleared. I want the world to finally hear the truth. That is all I ask for. Gabriel nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. More than anyone else there, he was a man who held honor above all else. In his world, a person's honor was their most valuable possession. You can lose your fortune and earn it back. You can lose a house and build a new one. But if you lose your honor, it can never be replaced. You will have both, Gabriel stated, his voice as solid as a vow. Richard raised his head, barely able to process what he was hearing. Both, Gabriel repeated with emphasis. The money and your honor. You will have both. He glanced at Victoria, who was still on her knees, crying like a lost child. Then he turned back to Richard. I will personally repay every dollar she stole from you. $2 million from my own accounts. Victoria looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Gabriel, she whispered, her voice shaking. You do not have to do that. That is your money. Gabriel paid her no attention. He continued speaking to Richard as if she were not even in the room. And I will make certain the truth is made public. My lawyers are the most skilled in Chicago. They will help you reopen the legal proceedings. They will prove your innocence in a court of law. They will ensure your good name is restored in the public record. He paused, and his eyes became chips of ice as they flickered to Victoria. And she will answer for what she did to you, for the years of torment she inflicted. She will pay for every single moment. Richard just stood there, completely stunned. He could not grasp what was happening. For 5 years, he had been to every agency, every courthouse, every law office. He had begged for someone to just listen. He had tried to scream his innocence to the world, but nobody ever believed him. No one would hear him out. Nobody cared about a homeless man with a wild story. And now, Gabriel Thornton, the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld, was standing right in front of him. A man whose word could shift the fate of the entire city. And that man had just told him he believed him, that he would help him, and that he would get him justice. Tears started to roll down Richard's face. These were not the tears of suffering he had cried for years. These were tears of catharsis, tears of hope. These were the tears of a man who was finally seen, finally heard, and finally believed. You, Richard said, his voice so thick with emotion he could hardly form the words. You believe me? I believe you, Gabriel answered, his voice softer but absolutely firm. And I will make sure everyone else believes you, too. Richard could no longer contain it. He began to cry with abandon. He cried like a small child, as if all the agony, all the injustice, and all the desperate, lonely nights from the past 5 years were being washed away. This was the first time in 5 years anyone had believed his story. The first time anyone had met his eyes and told him he was not a criminal. The first time someone had taken his side. Thank you, Richard wept, the words catching between his ragged breaths. Thank you. Thank you. Gabriel put a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. You have no reason to thank me. This is simply what is right. Justice was owed to you 5 years ago. I am just seeing that it arrives, even if it is terribly late. Nana Teresa stood behind them, offering a silent nod of approval. Pride filled her eyes as she looked at her grandson. This was the Gabriel she had raised. This was the man she always knew he could be. A man who knew right from wrong. A man who would fight for what is just. A man who was worthy of the Thornton name. Gabriel then turned his gaze to Victoria. She was still a heap on the floor, her face a blur of tears, her body shaking uncontrollably. He once thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He had once planned to spend his life with her. But looking at her now, Gabriel saw only a stranger, a liar, the ghost of a person he had once thought was real. He stepped toward her. The fire of his earlier anger was gone. In its place was only exhaustion, disappointment, and the hollow ache of a man who has lost something irreplaceable. It was not love he had lost, but trust, the very ability to believe in someone he thought he knew completely. "Victoria," Gabriel said, his voice low and heavy with finality. "Our engagement is cancelled." The words echoed in the quiet hall like a funeral bell. Victoria jerked her head up, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" she screamed, the sound sharp with desperation. "Gabriel, no! You cannot do this to me. I love you. I really, truly love you." She scrambled toward him, her arms wrapping around his leg like a drowning victim grasping for a final piece of wreckage. "I will change. I swear it. I will become the woman you want me to be. I will do anything. Anything. Please do not abandon me." She wept, her once perfect face ruined by streams of tears and sorrow. "I understand I was wrong. I know my actions were terrible, but I can be different. I promise you. I promise God, I will be different." Gabriel gazed down at the woman clinging to his legs, but he was numb. There was no rage, no compassion, no resentment, only a great, hollow void. He bent over and gently unwrapped Victoria's fingers from his leg. He peeled them away one by one. The movements were slow, and they were final. "You should have become a better person before you destroyed lives," Gabriel said, his voice unusually serene. "Not at this moment. Not when you are exposed. Not when you are left with no other path." Victoria looked up at him, her eyes filled with absolute despair. But Gabriel had already turned his back. He could not stand to see her. He did not want to see her ever again. In that moment, Nana Teresa came forward. She moved slowly to kneel beside Victoria, placing her oak cane on the floor. It was an act that no one in the room could have predicted. Nana Teresa, the most formidable woman in the Thornton family, was on her knees next to the person who had betrayed her grandson. "Child," Nana Teresa began, her tone surprisingly soft, "I will not make excuses for your actions. The wrongs you have committed cannot be erased." She laid a hand on Victoria's shoulder, a touch Victoria never anticipated. "But I think there is still an opportunity for you to change. A person can stumble, but they can also rise. You can be more than this." Victoria stared at her, tears still falling in a ceaseless flow. But Nana Teresa's voice grew stronger. "Before you can change, however, you must accept the consequences of your deeds. You must pay for your sins. You must offer restitution to those you have harmed. That is the first step, and it is a step you are not allowed to avoid." Victoria nodded, too exhausted to say another word. She understood. She knew what awaited her, and she submitted to it because there was nothing else to do. Gabriel gestured for his attorney to approach. A binding agreement was prepared right there. Victoria would return the entire sum of money she had stolen. She would give her full cooperation to the investigators. She would provide testimony in court to restore Richard's reputation. She would submit to any sentence the law decided. Victoria put her name on the document. Her hand trembled so violently that her signature was nearly illegible, but she signed it because it was the only power she had left. Two guards entered, their manner gentle yet firm, and helped Victoria stand. They were to lead her from the estate, from Gabriel's world, from the entire life she had constructed upon deceit. Before she was gone, Victoria paused. She turned for a final look at Gabriel. Her eyes were swollen and her face was colorless, but in her expression, there was a sincerity he had never witnessed from her before. "Gabriel," she said, her voice strained but audible, "my love for you was real. You may not trust a single thing I ever told you. You may believe it was all a performance, but the love I had for you was genuine. That was the only part that was not a lie." Gabriel watched her for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice gentle and laced with sadness. "I wish your love had revealed itself through truth, not through deception." Victoria shut her eyes. A final tear traced a path down her cheek. Then she allowed the guards to guide her away. The massive doors swung open. Light from the hallway poured in once more. Victoria crossed the threshold, stepping into the darkness that lay ahead. She did not turn around. The doors clicked shut behind her. The sound was dry and final, like a book being closed for the last time. One story had concluded, and another was ready to start. Gabriel remained standing, staring at the closed doors. He was not sure what he felt. It was a mixture of relief, agony, and weariness. Everything was twisted into a knot he could not loosen. But he was certain of one thing. He had made the correct choice, and that was the only thing that was important. The celebration ended in stillness. The music stopped. The laughter vanished. The congratulations and polite greetings ceased. 300 guests departed in single file, taking with them the incredible story they had just seen unfold. It was the story of Gabriel Thornton's fiancée, the flawless woman who was revealed to be an imposter. It was the story of Richard Donovan, a man falsely condemned for 5 years, at last vindicated. It was the story of justice, delayed but not denied. Thornton Manor became empty. The crystal chandeliers continued to shine, but their illumination now seemed colder. The grand walls remained standing, but they appeared to whisper about the events that had just transpired. Gabriel stood by himself on the balcony, looking out at the darkened garden. He had been there for an hour, without speaking, without moving, just thinking about Victoria, about the deception, about the 3 years he had lost to a fantasy. Then he went back inside. The great hall was nearly deserted now. The household staff moved without a sound, collecting glasses and folding tablecloths. They worked in a shared silence, as if worried they might disturb the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the residence. And that is when Gabriel saw her. Evelyn. She was in a distant corner of the hall by herself, quietly putting chairs away. She did not request help from anyone. She did not voice any complaints. She simply performed her duties as if this night was no different from any other. Gabriel started walking in her direction. His shoes made little sound on the marble floor. Evelyn heard his approach, raised her head, and paused when she recognized him. "Sir," she said, her voice even but with a hint of surprise. "Is there something you require?" Gabriel did not respond immediately. He just stood there observing her, observing the 27-year-old woman with dark brown hair, pulled back in a neat bun, observing green eyes as clear as a lake in autumn, observing a face that was tired but still illuminated by a stubborn strength. She was a small woman without wealth. She owned nothing but her own 2 hands and her determination, but she possessed a quality that Victoria, the beautiful and rich woman he once loved, never had. She had dignity, true dignity, not the kind purchased with currency or polished with falsehoods. "You were the reason everything changed tonight," Gabriel said, his voice quiet and deliberate. Evelyn furrowed her brow as if she did not grasp his meaning. "Sir, I do not understand." Gabriel took one step closer. "If you had not defended Henry, we would not have learned the truth about Victoria. If you had not taken a stand, I would have continued to be fooled. If not for you, Richard Donovan would still be a condemned man." He looked directly into her eyes. "You altered the course of everything with a single choice, with the bravery to speak the truth." Evelyn shook her head softly. "Sir, I did not do anything remarkable. I simply did what I knew was right. Any person with a conscience would have done the same thing." Gabriel smiled. It was a small smile, his first since the evening began. "That is precisely what makes you remarkable." He turned toward the window, his sight fixed on something far away. "You know," he said, his voice even softer now, "my mother passed away when I was very young, but I have never forgotten something she told me." Evelyn remained silent, listening. Gabriel continued. "She said, 'A good person is not defined by their power, nor by their money or their reputation. A good person is someone who lends their voice to protect the voiceless.'" He faced Evelyn again. That is exactly what you did today. You used your voice to shield Henry, a man who was about to lose everything. You stood before 300 powerful individuals, before a woman who could have ruined you with a single command. You possessed nothing, but you possessed courage, and that courage was the catalyst for everything. Evelyn felt a sting in her eyes. She was not accustomed to receiving praise. She was not accustomed to having her actions acknowledged. Her entire life, she had been used to being cast aside, overlooked, and treated as if she were invisible. But the man before her, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, was looking at her as if she was important. "Thank you," Evelyn managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "But I honestly did not do anything of great importance. I just could not remain quiet while another person was being treated with such injustice. I am familiar with that feeling. I am familiar with that pain, and I would not wish for anyone else to suffer through it." Gabriel nodded slowly. He understood more than she knew. "And that is the reason I respect you," he said. "Evelyn Sinclair." After that significant night of the party, existence at the Thornton estate gradually settled into its old rhythm. But certain things were permanently altered. Victoria was no longer there. The secret had been brought to light. And Gabriel, although he never spoke it aloud, could not get the young woman who had stood up to 300 powerful people to defend a simple server out of his mind. One day following the party, Gabriel asked Henry to come to his office. The 45-year-old man entered with a nervous expression, uncertain of what mistake he might have made, but Gabriel did not ask him about his job. He asked him about Evelyn. "Tell me about her," Gabriel requested, his voice calm but focused. "What type of person is she?" Henry was taken aback, but he shared what he knew, the details he had gathered from short talks with Evelyn on their breaks, that she was orphaned at a young age, that she had endured many years in a group home, that she had been independent since she was 16, that she worked 3 jobs simultaneously just to make ends meet. And then Henry spoke about Chloe, Evelyn's sister, who was 24 years old, born with a serious heart problem and in desperate need of an operation. The procedure cost $200,000, a sum that Evelyn could not imagine ever earning. "She works constantly, sir," Henry explained, his voice filled with sympathy. 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. She was wasting away before his very eyes, yet she never spoke a word of her own struggle. Her only mission, she insisted, was to save her sister, whatever the cost. Gabriel watched her in silence, and a firm resolution began to form within him. A week passed, and Evelyn returned to their tiny apartment after another grueling day. Fatigue was a heavy weight on her bones, making it an effort just to remain upright. But that feeling vanished the instant she saw Chloe perched on the bed, offering a weak but hopeful smile. "A letter came for you," Chloe announced, her voice fragile but laced with excitement. From the hospital, Evelyn's brow furrowed. A hospital letter. She had no scheduled appointments, no pending results. She accepted the envelope, tore it open, and her eyes scanned the page. In that moment, she became completely motionless. Her eyes grew wide. A tremor started in her hand. She read the words over and over, unable to believe what they said. The total surgical cost for Chloe Sinclair had been covered, $200,000 paid in full. There was no outstanding balance. "What is it, Evelyn?" Chloe's voice was filled with concern as she watched her sister stand there, frozen. Evelyn could not speak. Tears started to trace paths down her face. These were not the familiar tears of pain she had cried so many times. They were tears of pure joy, of absolute relief. They were the tears of someone discovering that miracles could actually happen. Her gaze dropped back to the paper, searching for the name of their savior. But the line was blank. It only contained the words, "Anonymous benefactor." No identity, no return address, and no mention of repayment. But Evelyn knew. Her heart knew exactly who it was. Only one person was capable of such a thing. Only one person knew the depths of her desperation. Only one person had seen her with respect and told her she had changed everything: Gabriel Thornton. Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest and finally broke down, her body shaking with sobs. She wept because Chloe had a future. She wept because the impossible weight she had carried for 2 long years was suddenly gone. She wept because a person in this world had truly seen her, had cared, and had helped her without expecting a single thing in return. "What is wrong?" Chloe cried out, her voice rising with panic. "Why are you crying like that?" Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and gently took Chloe's hand in hers. "You are going to have the operation," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion but shining with happiness. "You are going to heal. You are going to live." Chloe just stared, her eyes wide with shock. "For real? You found the money?" Evelyn shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "An amazing person helped us. A truly good person." Later that night, long after Chloe had drifted into a deep sleep, Evelyn stood at the small window of their apartment. She gazed out into the dark, toward the distant hill where the lights of the Thornton mansion glittered like a private constellation. She offered no spoken thanks. She understood she would likely never have the chance. Still, she hoped that Gabriel would somehow feel her gratitude. Her silent vigil in the direction of his home conveyed everything that words could not capture. 6 months later, spring had returned to Chicago, carrying with it warm air and soft sunlight. The new season marked a new beginning for everyone involved in this story. Richard Donovan, the man who had lost 5 years of his life in a nightmare for a crime he did not commit, was officially and completely exonerated. The court pronounced him innocent. The media broadcast his story. The entire world finally learned what had really happened. But more important than anything, his daughter returned to his life. She was a 20-year-old woman now, and she sobbed as she held her father, telling him how sorry she was for ever believing the lies. Richard wept with her. He embraced his daughter tightly and assured her that he had forgiven her a long, long time ago. Using the funds Gabriel had provided as restitution, Richard started a small electronics repair business in the Chicago suburbs. The shop did not generate a lot of income, but it gave him a profound sense of purpose and peace. He woke up with a smile each morning, worked with his hands, and returned home to his daughter at night. It was everything he ever wanted. Chloe, Evelyn's sister, underwent a successful operation. The procedure took 8 hours, but the outcome was better than anyone had dared to hope. Her doctor confirmed that Chloe could now expect to live a full and healthy life, just like anyone else. When Evelyn heard those words, her strength left her, and she collapsed to her knees in the hospital corridor, overcome with emotion. She wept not from sorrow, but from the immense relief of knowing that, for the first time, the fear of losing the person she loved most in the world was gone. Victoria, who was once called Camille, accepted the consequences of her actions. Her full cooperation with the investigation resulted in a suspended sentence instead of time in prison. She entered therapy, beginning the long process of healing the deep-seated trauma that had made her so cruel. Her path to becoming a better person would be difficult, but she had finally taken the first step. And Evelyn, the quiet woman who found the courage to speak truth to a room of 300 powerful people, was promoted to the position of event manager for the Thornton estate. She no longer had to work 3 jobs just to survive. Her days of rising at 4 in the morning and not sleeping until past midnight were over. She could at last have a normal existence, with a stable job and an income that could support both her and her sister. Regarding Gabriel and Evelyn, their relationship unfolded without any hurry or pressure. They did not try to label what was between them. They simply enjoyed being near one another. They had long talks on the balcony while the sun set. They shared warm mugs of tea on frosty winter mornings. They exchanged small, knowing smiles when their eyes met across a busy room. They shared silences that were filled with unspoken understanding. One evening in spring, Gabriel and Evelyn stood together on the estate's balcony, looking out at a garden bursting with flowers. A gentle breeze moved through the air, bringing with it the sweet smell of roses and jasmine. Thank you, Evelyn, Gabriel said, his voice soft and full of warmth. You made all the difference simply by being brave. Evelyn turned to him and smiled, a truly radiant smile, as bright as the sun after a cleansing rain. It was her first such smile after countless years of hardship. It was the smile of a person who had finally found her peace. And for the first time in any of their lives, the story ended on a happy note. It concluded with the truth being revealed. It concluded with justice being served. It concluded with broken people starting to heal. It concluded with the tranquility that each of them had earned. This tale imparts a powerful lesson about life. It shows that truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always find its way to the light. It shows that justice, even when it is delayed, is far better than no justice at all. It shows that a person's true value lies not in their wealth or status, but in the way they treat other people. And it shows that sometimes the courage of one person to stand up is all it takes to change the entire world. My dear friends, our tale comes to a close today. How has this story affected you? Did it bring to mind anything from your own life experiences? Please share your reflections in the comments section below. We are genuinely eager to hear your thoughts. If you found value in this story, we invite you to press the like button and share this video with the people you care about. And if you are not yet a subscriber to our channel, please subscribe now to ensure you do not miss our moving stories each day. Finally, we want to wish everyone watching this video good health, a life full of joy, and daily peace. Thank you for spending this time with us. Goodbye, and we will see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and valuable takeaways for our audience.